The United States entered Vietnam with unmatched military power, determined to crush communism, but this war would prove to be one of its darkest chapters. How did America, the global superpower, lose in Vietnam? Let's uncover the story, starting from the moment the US officially entered the war. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked US destroyers, Congress handed President Johnson a blank check. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave him the power to wage war without formally declaring it, a green light for full-scale military intervention. By March 1965, the first wave of American combat troops arrived in Da Nang. They were greeted with optimism and fanfare. That year alone, over 200,000 troops landed in Vietnam. The goal? To make North Vietnam pay for its aggression and crush the Viet Cong insurgency in the south. This marked the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign designed to break the North's will to fight. Over the next 3 years, the United States dropped nearly 643,000 tons of bombs, obliterating infrastructure, supply routes, and entire villages. But despite the destruction, North Vietnam refused to surrender, and the campaign failed to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, their lifeline to the south. The US also turned to chemical warfare, deploying Agent Orange to defoliate jungles and expose enemy hideouts. Over 19 million gallons of the toxic herbicide were sprayed across Vietnam, devastating the environment and causing long-term health issues for millions, including birth defects and cancers among Vietnamese civilians and US veterans. Back home, the war was already controversial. By 1967, discontent was rising. Campus protests became a daily occurrence, and fewer than half of Americans polled supported President Johnson's handling of the war. Questions of morality loomed large as the death toll mounted, with no clear end in sight. Then came the Tet Offensive in early 1968, a turning point that brought the war crashing into America's living rooms. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the General Offensive General Uprising during the Lunar New Year, Tet, catching American and South Vietnamese forces off guard. While 50,000 US and South Vietnamese troops defended the Marine base at Khe Sanh, the Communists unleashed a massive attack across South Vietnam. On January 31st, they hit 36 of 44 provincial capitals, 64 district capitals, and more than 24 airfields and bases, plunging the South into chaos. Though the Communists ultimately failed to hold most of their targets, the psychological impact was devastating. Americans watching the carnage on TV began to question why their sons were dying in a war that seemed unwinnable. The illusion of victory was shattered. Faced with mounting public pressure, President Johnson announced on March 31st, 1968, that he would halt the bombing of North Vietnam and not seek re-election. Within days, Hanoi expressed readiness to negotiate, and peace talks began in Paris in May. Yet they quickly stalled as both sides refused to compromise. Meanwhile, the war raged on. Determined to capitalize on the Tet Offensive, the Communists launched 2 more waves of attacks in May and August. The US and ARVN forces responded with unrelenting pressure. The fighting was brutal. Between April and June alone, 3,700 Americans were killed, 18,000 wounded, and tens of thousands of ARVN and Communist soldiers lost their lives. In November 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency. While public opinion demanded an end to the war, Nixon feared that a hasty withdrawal would damage US credibility worldwide. His solution? Vietnamization, a plan to train and equip South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting as American troops gradually withdrew. Over the next 4 years, Nixon pursued a dual strategy, withdrawing US troops while escalating bombing campaigns to pressure the North into peace talks. By 1972, US ground forces had fallen from over 500,000 to fewer than 30,000. Yet the fighting continued. Finally, in January 1973, after years of grueling negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the release of prisoners of war, and the withdrawal of all remaining US troops. But even as American forces left Vietnam, the North Vietnamese prepared for their final move. With US troops gone, South Vietnam faced an emboldened North. In early 1975, the Communists launched a lightning offensive, rapidly capturing cities as the ARVN crumbled under the pressure. By April, they reached Saigon. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, marked the end of the Vietnam War. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the city as panicked crowds desperately tried to escape. The iconic images of helicopters evacuating Americans and their allies symbolized not just the end of the war, but the failure of US policy in Vietnam. So why did the United States, the world's most powerful nation, lose in Vietnam, underestimating the enemy? The US underestimated the determination and resilience of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Their guerrilla tactics and use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail turned every inch of Vietnam into a battlefield, lack of a clear objective. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam lacked clear military objectives. The US couldn't define what victory looked like. Home front divisions. At home, anti-war protests, media scrutiny, and public disillusionment eroded support for the war. Cultural misunderstanding. The US failed to grasp the nationalist and anti-colonial motivations of the Vietnamese people, framing the conflict purely as a fight against communism. From its tragic beginning to its chaotic end, the Vietnam War reshaped history. For the United States, it was a sobering lesson in the limits of military power. For Vietnam, it was a testament to resilience and the devastating cost of freedom. But above all, it remains a reminder of the human cost of war. Thank you for watching Tales of History. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the past and learned something new about the events that shaped our world. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who love history as much as we do. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future episodes. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating stories of history with us. And remember, history isn't just the past. It's the key to understanding our present and shaping our future.